The story I want to share today is a case that happened way back in 1987. This case always stuck with me because not only was it a tragic case of family mass murder, but of betrayal from beyond the grave. A victim accused of murder. In 1987, in the heart of Elkland, Missouri, located in Webster County, a small community of around 200 people lived, with only a few stores, one post office, and many small farms. Everyone knew each other, and they had all their lives. Elkland's primary agricultural industry was dairy farming. Steve Buckner, 35, was one of those farmers. The son of a respected dairy farmer, Steve bought his farm in 1979. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Jan, who was 36. Steve was described as a good guy and very likable. The couple had 4 sons, Kirk, 14, Dennis, 8, Timmy, 6, and Michael, 2. Working the farm was a family affair. To the community, no one worked harder than Steve's oldest son, Kirk. Kirk was described as a thin, wiry, super friendly kid, courteous, and he had many friends. Kirk worked hard on his family's farm. He loved his family and helped look after his younger brothers. A friend did say that Kirk would get sad on occasion, telling media that Kirk would mope around and not want to go fishing or anything. Just up the road lived Steve's sister, Julie, who was 30, with her husband, Jim, 36, a volunteer firefighter and dairy farmer. The couple was married for 11 years and had 2 children, Jamie, 8, and Mindy, 6. For many years, the 2 families lived what was considered the American dream. However, in the mid-80s, things changed, and the dream slowly became a nightmare. The economy was not in a good place, and American farmers felt the crisis. Farmers began losing their farms. Interest rates were too high, so it was hard to borrow money and even harder to pay it back. Farm values fell as much as 50%. By 1985, up to 250 farmers were losing their farms every day. Celebrities showed their support by reaching out to the public via Farm Aid. They also testified before Congress. The Buckner family was not immune to the crisis. By August 1987, Steve had fallen behind in his mortgage. Many dairies were shutting down and people could barely get by. The threat of losing the farm loomed over Steve. He could not afford help, so the entire family had to work the farm. Kirk slept in a camper shell on the back of a pickup truck in the yard. He was up with the sun every morning, and by 7:45, he finished his chores on the farm and was on the bus for school. After a full day of school, he would return on that same bus. While the Buckners were struggling to stay afloat, brother-in-law Jim Schnick claimed not to be in jeopardy of losing his farm. Jim would help Steve by lending him tools and farm equipment. However, Steve's struggles led him to make poor decisions. Jim claimed that Steve was taking equipment without permission. Jim believed Steve didn't have the drive or discipline to keep his farm going. He said that Steve depended too much on his wife and eldest child to do most of the work. Steve's reliance on Jim's generosity caused tension in the family. After several years of buildup, things came to a head and the strain was too much. The relationship between the brothers-in-law was broken. On September 25, 1987, a call came into the Webster County Dispatch. When the operator answered, a voice on the other end told her, "I've been shot." The call was coming from the Schnick residence. When the police arrived, they found Jim shot, alive, but incoherent. He had a gunshot wound to his leg and a stab wound to his stomach. Police tried to question him, but he could not share any details. When police go to clear the house, they find Jim's wife, Julie, in her bed shot. She had been asleep. Police went to the bedroom of the Schnick children, 8-year-old Jamie and 6-year-old Mindy, and found them alive and well. Meanwhile, back downstairs, feet from where Jim Schnick's body laid, Kirk Buckner's was also in the hallway. He had knife wounds as well as bullet wounds to his chest. There was also a bullet wound in his neck and a handgun in his right hand. Jim was airlifted to the nearest hospital. The sheriff had to go to the Buckner farm to inform the family of Kirk's death. They traveled the few miles down the road to the Buckner farm and found it quiet, possibly too quiet. The sheriff felt dread as he went to the door. No one answered the bell. A deputy looked through the front window of the modest farmhouse. The younger children slept in the front part of the house, and what he saw through that window was a nightmare. There was blood everywhere. When the police entered, they found all 3 of the remaining Buckner children shot execution style. The 2 older children while asleep in their bed and the youngest in his playpen. The police had not yet found Steve or Jan in the house. Outside by the milk barn, Jan was found shot in the back of the head. They searched the entire farm but could not find Steve. Police launched a search for Steve. They didn't know if he was another victim or the killer. They searched the fields between the 2 farms. Later that day, police spot something halfway between the 2 properties, near a small cemetery. It's the body of Steve Buckner. Police wonder if he has taken his own life. They don't have to wonder long, though. As they move closer to the body, they discover 2 gunshot wounds to the back of Steve's head. The grass indicated that the killer had dragged Steve to this final spot. With the discovery of Steve, the victim count is now at 7. The entire Buckner family was dead, as well as Steve's sister and Jim's wife, Julie Schnick. The Schnick children are safe with Julie's parents, and Jim is in the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. When police finally talk to Jim, he tells them that he had gotten up early that morning to check on a cow due to calf. As he walked back to the house, he saw some flashes, and then a shadowy form appeared near his front door. He then recalled seeing a man. He was then shot in the leg. He says he picked up a knife, charged down the hallway, and began physically fighting with the shadow. They grappled over the gun and the blade. Jim told police he remembered stabbing with the knife before the shadow figure became quiet. The shadowy figure, of course, was his nephew Kirk Buckner. Police now had a theory of what happened. They believe Kirk killed his mother Jan out by the barn. They are unsure if he killed Steve and then drove him to the site where his body was found. They believe he then went and shot his 2 brothers asleep in their bed before going to the playpen and killing his youngest sibling. After this, they said, Kirk got in the truck and drove 5 miles down the road to his aunt's house, where she and his young cousins were asleep inside. The news media and people in the community began to speculate. Some said that Kirk had been acting strangely as recently as the night before. Given the state of their depressed farming community, some could reason that it wasn't impossible to believe that a young man under so much pressure could go on a rampage and kill his entire family. But no one could answer the question of why. Police interviewed some of Kirk's classmates in the hopes of finding out what could have motivated these events. One friend told police that Kirk complained that his father was lazy and recalled Kirk once stating that he'd like to kill him. Without more answers, people struggled to understand. The community came together to mourn. The funerals took place at the Timber Ridge Cemetery, and hundreds of people came to say their final goodbyes. Mourners recall the caskets all being lined up in a row. Jim Schnick was unable to walk, so he stayed in the car and watched from the window as his family was buried. After the funerals, neighbors gathered at the home of the Schnick and Buckner families and began to scrub them down, erasing any physical reminder of the tragedy. Police had their suspect, and they were close to closing the case. But before they did, the sheriff received a phone call that could change everything. 4 days after the crime, one of Kirk's teachers called the sheriff and asked for clarification. "You said the gun was in Kirk's right hand?" "Yes," the sheriff responded. "Well, Kirk was left-handed." This detail left police perplexed and ready to re-examine their original theory of the crime. Kirk shot his dad, loaded his body into the pickup, drove to the cemetery, and dragged him into the weeds. Now thinking about this with a broader lens, police consider that Kirk had a slight build. Steve Buckner, however, was at least close to double his son's size. Would Kirk have the strength to load his father into the truck and then drag him? While police reviewed the facts of the case, the community began to voice doubts. Kirk's friends and teachers refused to believe that he was capable of such carnage. No one could recall one instance of Kirk being violent. They wanted to be sure that news media knew that he was a good kid and loved his mother and siblings very much. While police and some community elders can accept that poverty and relentless hard work could drive the teen to murder, they were in the minority. But while the community talked over morning coffee or while meeting up in the market, the overwhelming consensus was that Kirk was not capable of such carnage. Many tips and calls began to flow into the police by residents adamant that he was not guilty. What the police said happened made no sense to people. At the scene, police had collected many pieces of evidence. They had Jim Schnick's overalls. He had been wearing them at the time of the shooting. They were cut off of him and sent to the crime lab. They collected the knife and a .22 caliber 6-shot revolver found in Kirk's right hand. They also took samples of blankets and clothing. They interviewed neighbors that said they heard voices and gunshots coming from the Buckner farm at around 4:55 a.m. Now they started to look closer at the gun registered to his mother. It was a .22 caliber 6-shot revolver. To reload it, the retaining pin had to be removed, the cylinder filled and put back. Then the cylinder retaining pin inserted to hold that cylinder in place when the killer fired the gun. The gun would not fire without the cylinder having a pin in position to fire the 17 bullets discharged that morning. But the pin is nowhere to be found. Police intended to return to the crime scene and search. However, well-meaning neighbors had scrubbed both homes. They thought they were helpful, but had ruined any chance of police revisiting the crime scene. Police were at a standstill. They also believed that Jim was playing up his injuries, trying to avoid being discharged from the hospital. Before the murders took place, Jim had been telling Julie that he had ongoing doctor's appointments in Springfield with a physical therapist named Nancy. There were rumors that this was more than a professional relationship. When police went to speak to Nancy, she initially denied that they were anything but friends. But the next day she called police back and admitted it was much more. Jim had assured her he was getting a divorce and would get custody of his kids so they could get married. Jim told police he did try and work on his marriage, even going to counseling. In the summer of 1987, Nancy was tired of getting the runaround from Jim, and she went to the Schnick residence and talked to Julie herself. What she found out from Julie was that Jim had lied to her. Nancy was furious, and Julie was ready to end her marriage. Now the police were beginning to wonder if Jim's affair had anything to do with the mass murder of his family. Police had uncovered Jim Schnick's secret. However, they weren't ready to rule out Kirk as a suspect. That was until Kirk's autopsy report came in. According to the pathologist, the story police gave and the evidence they had on Kirk's body did not match up. Police assumed Kirk died from the knife and bullet wounds in the chest and neck while fighting with his uncle, but this was not the case. Kirk had been shot once in the chest, but the bullet was a dud. It had just made an indentation on his chest. The fatal injury to him turned out to be a shot that pierced his heart and entered through his back. Laying on the ground, having been shot in the back, Kirk is then shot in the neck. The autopsy showed Kirk was already dead when Jim placed the knife in him. Jim Schnick claimed to have shot Kirk in self-defense. So why was there a bullet in the 14-year-old's back? Also, how did this same gun end up in Kirk's right hand? Suspicions were shifting. Further evidence from the crime lab further cemented the idea for police. There was gunshot residue on the leg of the overalls Jim Schnick was wearing when he was shot. However, it was inside the pant leg, a sign that Jim could have shot himself. The overalls had more secrets to reveal because in the pants pocket, the crime lab found the piece of evidence they had lost all hope of finding. They found the cylinder retaining pin. The pin that would make it possible for the gun to fire was in Jim's pocket. On October 1st, police arrested Jim Schnick. Investigators recorded Jim's statement. According to Jim, his wife Julie was so upset about finding out about Jim's affair that she called her brother, Steve, for support. Steve immediately went to his sister, bringing the gun registered to his wife. Jim said he noticed a set of lights coming towards him. He says that when he got up there to the house, Steve was there and he was angry. Years of resentment had come to the surface. He said, "I'll just get rid of all this. We'll clean it up right now. Hey, you can be out of the picture. You can be out of the family. You're of no importance." Jim said that a flare went up inside him and he felt it was him or Steve. He claimed that they fought over the pistol and then Jim heard it go off once and then he just kind of went limp. Jim claimed that his actions were in self-defense. Police believe that Steve was not killed in self-defense as he was shot in the back of the head. Jim then got rid of his brother-in-law's body. He realized that Jan knew Steve was at the house. So he went to the house and shot her in her bed. Kirk, sleeping in the family camper, woke up at the sound of the shot and tried to escape. Jim told police he chased Kirk and they fought, but the autopsy proved this was a lie. Kirk was shot in the back while running away. Jim realized that Kirk was still alive, but barely. He picked him up and went home. He killed his wife. He finishes off Kirk and then shot himself in the leg. The police now have a new theory about Jim's motive. Jim was under pressure trying to juggle his farm, his family, and his girlfriend. Julie told him she would divorce him, and the appearance of her brother early that morning defending his sister was a breaking point. Jim's actions defied all reason. No one will probably ever know the exact steps that took place on that September morning in 1987. People can only theorize because Jim is the only one left to tell the tale. But the evidence spoke the truth. Jim's confession only added to that, and he was charged with first-degree murder. The defense went with a plea of temporary insanity, stating that for hours Jim did not know what he was doing. The packed courtroom waited for the outcome. Ultimately, Jim was willing to plead guilty if the prosecutor took the death penalty off the table. Sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, Jim Schnick now calls the Missouri State Prison home. He claims that he blocked that day out and says he can't see himself stepping over that line to lose it that badly. In taped interviews with police, Jim said, "Because of my feelings, I went in the house and destroyed the other 3 children, and I turned and went back into the house. I went to tell my wife to get up, that something had went wrong. I had the gun in my hand, holding Kirk over my shoulder. There was a movement and the gun went off, striking my wife."